Hey, and this is an update to my earlier video. I got some pushback on my notions that the DSA can't hold its candidates accountable, since it does require them to confess to be socialism without defining what socialism is. A moniker is not a statement of programmatic unity, but let's be more specific. Let's apply some rigorous standards here. If you think about what the various Democratic Party organizations, be they caucuses, the Progressive Caucus, for example, which a lot of DSA candidates would also be a part of, be they the DNC, the DLC, the Democratic National Convention and the Democratic Leadership Caucuses, and the various private corporations which exist within that, outside of the realm of popular democracy. There are lots of ways in which the Democrats can procedurally stranglehold and limit socialist and progressive candidates within their ranks. The DSA, however, cannot counterbalance that despite having significant numbers of activists. Its numbers are somewhere between 80 and 90,000, which makes it larger now than the SDS was, and than the Students for a Democratic Society was in its heyday, which was, I think the SDS had about 60,000. But for real accountability, you would need the ability to not just get a bunch of activists enthused, but to have institutions that could serve as counterpower. Now, of course, ideally it would be a third party, but given the way the Constitution in the United States is written, getting a third party on the national level regards changing the laws in 50 states simultaneously or close to it with bars to entry, meaning that you can get on a ballot but probably never replace either of the two existing parties, which are protected by state law, even if they're not official state organs. This leads you into a rather precarious position, right? Because that means your institutional power so far would need to be something that is, properly speaking, not truly a party yet. Now, historically, that was unions. Unions came together, and when unions were in a particularly weak point, actually, they came together and formed the beginnings of a lot of the labor political parties. But Taft-Hartley in America makes that impossible. Plus, the fact that we aren't a parliamentary system, and this is very hard to launch a oppositional third party that will not take part in a coalitionary government, which is his historical position of the communists in relation to this. All you really left with is popular front style intrualism. But even that's not meaningful unless you have ways to hold that's accountable, that is stronger and more meaningfully protective than the various organs of the Democratic Party. That's really hard to imagine what that would look like. Coalitions of unions, things operating in legal and paralegal ways. There's all kinds of stuff it could mean. Furthermore, it seems to me that while there is some talk in the DSA chapters and locals about doing this, that hyper federation is part of the problem, since DSA locals can do this on a local level, but there's no programmatic unity. The DSA at the national level, there's no way for it to build approximate counterpower basis to any national level Democratic Party organ. It's just at a structural disadvantage, even for something like a dirty break as opposed by the Ackman plan or whatever. And again, I think this is a crisis of thinking, but you have to ask yourself, it's not just a choice of choosing the right values, right? This is not the values form of Walmart or Target where you just go in, look at a bunch of virtues and pick a couple. Now, I think as individuals, yes, we pick individual virtues, but they don't aggregate up. And why? We have to be somewhat rigorous in our understanding here, and saying something like, "Oh, it's capitalism," may be true, but completely unexplanatory. So, why is it that so many people are in this bind, and why is it that organizations that are big like this have trouble holding themselves to any accountability standards that would actually make them practical? In short, the sectarian organizations are useless because they're necessarily small, hyper devoted, and ideologically driven, where these broad tent social activist clubs are broad-based but necessarily hyper-confederated, so that the differences between the various ideological, tactical, and social and strategic tendencies don't cause splits, and are also disproportionately functioning with people with plenty of leisure time, um, meaning they're going to be largely pulling from a student base, because that's who has a lot of meaning time, and from a post-student base, from people who are underemployed and have the time, if not the money, to participate. In the past, this was handled again by operating within the confines and in cooperation with unions. And it's not that the DSA in certain areas, like Brooklyn, has not tried this. It has, but it has not been able to scale it on a national level, partly because it cannot deal with the catch-22 of unions aren't strong in most of the most red areas of the country. And by red, I mean red state, the Republican, but also in areas that are more working class and impoverished than a lot of the rest of the country. Furthermore, the inequality in areas that are blue, such as New York and California, have led to a discrediting of a lot of progressive politics. It is not a surprise to anyone that conservatives can easily point out liberals' hypocrisies in California, where progressive racial and gender policies are often given voice, but where progressive labor reforms are often killed dead, and where 80% of the population is below the median poverty line. I mean, below the median income, meaning that it's becoming a bifurcated world of the ultra rich and ultra poor, more like, say, Guatemala City than a shining city on the hill for leftists to emulate. If, for example, we want to make America California again, as Joe Biden once joked, we end up creating a performatively woke politics with nothing in the middle. Now, what does that have to do with the DSA? The DSA's strength base seems to actually be more in Washington State and a lot of the Northeast. Um, well, in some ways it doesn't, but in other ways, Washington and the Northeast show similar but not as exacerbated trends to California. And that makes the DSA popular. Lots of downwardly mobile people who would find its policies amenable, but who also know how to use cultural capital in a way a lot of woke people, working class people, don't. And so this is another structural problem. Furthermore, as working class areas have less and less money to fund education, and also the education itself becomes more and more politicized, both left and right, it becomes harder for anyone to feel like they can get a set of skills to improve themselves from an educational backdrop. Now, what does that have to do with the strategic problems of the DSA? What also means that people with less of an educational backdrop are more likely to be convinced of conspiratorial and easy answers, because often they have lots of intelligence but low information. And lots of intelligence and low information leads to the creation of elaborate stories. It is not the dumb who tend to fool themselves, it is the smart without context or with motivation who tend to fool themselves. And if you have a lot of smart working class people who are undereducated because the education in the area is really bad because it's underfunded, well, you can see where this goes. But funding isn't the only problem of education, frankly. A lot of the education problems don't have to do with funding. And again, what does that mean? So if we look at the various problems that I've said here, you see that there are 1,000 cul-de-sacs that jump up. And so talking about the actually existing socialist advocacy of the DSA is just a tiny part of the problem of doing socialist organizing. And if you can't admit these are problems, you can't do much about them. That's all.